Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and we have a very fun donation deck today from Lexa, which is Jetfire Powerstone Mana, or maybe Jetfire Powerstones. See, the funny thing is there aren't, as far as I can tell, any Powerstones in the deck. But let's let Lexa explain it themselves. They say, so I'm back with another weird deck, and this one requires me to discuss some rulings. The ability on Jetfire Ingenious Scientist to remove counters and gain colorless mana isn't technically a mana ability because it targets a player, which means it uses the stack and thus can be copied by things such as Illusionist Bracers, Rings of Bright Earth, and Lithiform Engine. This in turn means the deck can make insane amounts of mana. The problem is, and what I would like your help with, is that it's all Power Stone mana, i.e. it can only be used on it cannot be used on non-artifact spells. So it's all Power Stone mana, and I need more win conditions. Whether that is through other artifact options that I might have missed, or some big high-costing artifact abilities that do really powerful things. Absolutely, Lexa, and what an interesting kind of idea here. I really do like when Magic's rules change the way we would maybe approach a commander or a card in a commander deck. Specifically, the way Jetfire's ability allows us to copy it makes it very different from what I would consider to be the intended, play of Jetfire as a card. So that to me really catches my eye. I think my cats are trying to come in. There are some ideas about this deck I will have to discuss, and some ideas about this kind of brewing. But before we get to that, let's take a look at our commander and see what we can do. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So let's start at the beginning. Who is Jetfire Ingenious Scientist, and why are they the commander for our mono blue Power Stone deck? Jetfire is a 5-mana 3/4. You can either cast them on the front side or the back side, and you can cast them on the back side for 4 mana. We'll get to the back side in a second. On the front side, they're a 3/4 flying robot. I guess they're just a robot. Legendary artifact creature robot. And here is the most important ability. Remove 1 or more counters from among artifacts you control. Target player adds that much colorless mana. That mana can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells, and then you convert or transform, if you prefer, Jetfire to their other side. So before we go over that ability, let's just look at the other side. Jetfire Air Guardian is a 3/4 flyer. They are just a vehicle this time, legendary artifact. They have flying, and for blue, you convert, so flip them back to the other side, and then adapt 3. So if they have no counters, you put 3 counters on it. Very straightforwardly, the plan, I think, of intended play of Jetfire is that you cast Jetfire, you cast them probably on the other side, you get an attack in with a 3/4, you adapt for 3 blue mana to flip them back onto this side, making them a 6/7, and then at any time you want, you can remove those 3 counters, gain that 3 blue you put into them back as colorless Power Stone mana, flip them back, and repeat ad nauseum. Now this is fine and dandy, but as Lexa pointed out, this ability down here can be interacted with. Traditionally, for those who don't know, mana abilities, which is anything that generates mana, does not use the stack. It's why, your opponent can't interact with you tapping lands, for example. There's a lot of reasons for this, and sometimes it's used very, to protect things to make sure they work as intended, but also, it gets in the way sometimes, things like crack iron. It's right here. Give me a second. Crack Clan Ironworks. I know that as KCI, where it was a card that abused its ability as a mana ability to get around certain interaction without your opponents being able to interact with it. Very, very cool. Very, very interesting. But here, the main idea we're going to do is we're going to try to interact with this on the stack to create a copy. Of course, the main goal is to have the original be valuable enough, as in to generate enough mana as is, that as we spend mana to copy the ability, using cards like Rings of Bright Earth or the others Lexa mentioned, we still, benefit from that exchange and end up with, let's say, upwards of 10 plus mana. That's the goal. Obviously, the more of these cards that we have, if we have Illusionist Bracers and Rings of Bright Hearth, obviously it gets better. Or Bright Hearth? It's probably Bright Hearth, eh? Regardless, the ability gets better and better. So, before we go into this deck proper to see what Lexa has been doing with this mana, there is something to kind of think about when we get into this kind of situation, and I think this is kind of the trouble the deck has been in how it's being constructed. So, when we build a deck around a combo, especially a combo that comes around from the command zone or is a part of the command zone and generates something that we might consider to be particularly strong. In this one, it's not like infinite mana, but it's a tremendous amount of mana if you're doing it right. If you can, and I think it's reasonable, put 6 to 8 counters onto our commander, use the ability, copy the ability, maybe once or twice, you should end up with upwards of 20 extra mana that you wouldn't have otherwise. Ideally, some of that mana is going to be used to put counters back onto Jetfire to repeat the process. This is, of course, not even including the fact that Jetfire will benefit from never allowing that ability to actually resolve and copying it over and over again, or using the mana that off of the copy to reactivate Jetfire after you put a bunch of counters on it. Like there's a lot of moving parts there. So what all these moving parts do is generate a ton of mana. And the thing is what do we want to do with that? So the deck we're looking at is pretty much built to be an artifact +1/+1 counter deck, right? It's got definitely this kind of package here where we have all of these doublers and we have a bunch of other very good and powerful artifacts, including things like where are you? The Ozolith and the like. We have things like Manifold Key in order to both use this unblockability of really big creatures we have, but also we can use this to untap certain abilities such as the Lithoform engine, which needs to tap in order to do it, etc, etc. You can see it's like this very it's a machine that's operating really, really intensely to do this one thing. However, this one thing is held back by all these moving pieces. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, for example, if you had a commander that does something really, really well, and 80% of your deck is to make it happen, and 20% of your deck is to take advantage of it, you're going to have a hard time unless the commander is just so inherently powerful or what they do is really, really good. So for example, having a commander that makes a ton of energy only goes so far if you don't have any energy payoffs in your deck. Now you might say, Curse, a ton of artifact mana is particularly good, right? Like Powerstone mana can be used for a lot of different things. Why would this be a bottleneck? Well, as Lexa has found out themselves, when you're in mono blue, the amount of really, really good options are lower than you'd expect. Now, don't get me wrong, one of my previous decks that I've unfortunately taken apart at this point was Ashnod, mono black Ashnod, and that was a Powerstone deck as well. However, because of the fact that I was in black, I had access to things like Bolas' Citadel. I had access to things like, Possessed Portal and other black reanimation spells and activated abilities that would pull creatures from the graveyard. It was much more aggressively disruptive against its opponents, which is something that you have access to in black. And you have access to in black through artifacts. Whereas here, we don't have that as much. So what do? Well, we'll go to additions in a bit, but our main plan is that we should find a middle ground where we are using cards that both enable the deck to function and work well with our commander. And instead of trying to, this is my opinion, and we'll get to this in a second, but instead of trying to burn all of this tremendous amount of mana onto, let's say, one particularly good card, we should use it as a method of getting further in the game and getting more card advantage or board presence to get us in a situation where we can win otherwise. All right, I've talked a lot and we haven't looked at the deck. Let's look at the deck. One of the first things, obviously, is lands is at 35. I wouldn't mind to have a few more lands. Our commander is 5 mana, and though we have, some ramp, we're not really deep into it, so I like to at least get to 37 lands. Blue got a very good pair of MDFCs recently, so I'd like to play them, and beyond that, I think also having just 1 or 2 more blue, not necessarily even blue, like just ramp cards, because we could take advantage of things like Mind Stone, because we're mainly a colorless deck. So going up a bit higher would be nice. Looking at the curve, we do trail on for a while, but once again, like, that's not too bad, because we are trying to ramp into these very high mana cards, and some of these cards, especially at higher mana, such as Kappa Cannoneer, reduce their own mana cost themselves in order for you to be able to play them at a cheaper rate. Likewise, something that's worth noting is that our commander is probably easier to cast on 4 than they are to cast on 5, but depending on the situation, you'll have to kind of figure that out, because it is a little tricky to exactly know where you want that. So both 5 and 4 are acceptable kind of curving out for our commander. All right, looking at the deck otherwise, for what it's trying to be, which is kind of a non-combo focused, like, don't get me wrong, we're building towards a combo, but we're not doing it to win the game immediately. We're more of kind of like a mid-range deck plus, with a pretty strong aggro +1/+1 counter plan, paired with very explosive turns. When I'm looking in that direction, there's a few cards that stick out to me that I don't particularly like. The first ones are Counterspell and Disruption Protocol. Both of these I just don't particularly like here, mainly for the blue in a deck who really values their colored mana, because you can use as much colorless mana as you want on certain other cards, and especially Powerstone mana. Not that Powerstone mana can be used on these. Regardless, with that in mind, I do value these to be a little more difficult to cast, and I would rather them be cards like Negate, or otherwise Arcane Denial as well, where they are 1 and a blue in a deck that kind of gets away with a lot of colorless mana. So that being said, also, I don't know to what degree we're holding up Counterspell and Disruption Protocol being just a worse version of, Counterspell. And yes, that might be just like, it's objectively worse, and in this deck we can really take advantage, or like, it's not worse because we always have an artifact. It's still another thing you got to think in your head. So in my mind, if it was just Negate and Arcane Denial, I think I'd be pretty happy. Traditionally, this deck doesn't have a lot of cards that just clean wipe it out of the game. Maybe someone brings Stony Silence, that's a little rough, but much more likely we're going to be looking at things like mass artifact destruction, and Negate style cards will be just good enough to hit those. And it's not often that they're on creatures. Bane of Progress, of course, is an exception, but I don't see anyone play that card, and if you get Bane of Progress, rest in peace. I think that's just the game. The other cards that kind of catch my eye are the Planeswalkers. The Planeswalkers feel not conducive to what the deck is doing. I see them standing here or being stand-ins for whatever long-term win conditions we should be putting into the deck, and for that reason I'm not gonna push them too hard, but none of them really do something that is particularly interesting to the deck. The Tezzeret's, namely, both are cards that work really well in a traditional artifact style deck, which, though this artifact deck might, moonlight as one, it's not really the traditional style, and therefore they are good, but they're not being used to their main potential. And likewise with the Karns, both these Karns, though the Power Stone token aspect of Living Legacy is cute, and the -1 is cute as well, it feels like a very big investment in a deck that, doesn't really want to pay 4 mana to start slowly ramping Power Stones. Scion of Urza also is not a card I'm ever too impressed with, even though that -2 is particularly good. Once again, we are not a deck that goes unbelievably wide with artifacts. We're a deck that wants to use key artifacts and then start casting out artifacts. Narset, I think, of the 5, Narset is just the one that I'm fine with, because no matter how far we get into Commander, that static ability is really good. And though she will be probably hated out of the game, I do appreciate the fact that she can not tutor, but like impulse draw. What is this? 11, about more than a third of your deck at any time, which I do like. That being said, still probably not the best, but I would keep her at the 4. After that, there's a few cards here and there that kind of catch my eye. Steel Overseer feels interesting, kind of the slower one of these kind of other +1/+1 counter systems that we have here. Obviously, like Arcbound Ravager is way better, but both of these cards kind of depend on a certain ability to go wide, and I'm not sure to what degree we can do that. I think there's a lot of testing to be done on the ability to create a very wide board without, really investing in things like animation module and other kind of small 1/1 creature generation abilities, and to be left with something meaningful without it being like turn 8, 9, 10, where you get your engine online, and what your engine really does is slowly generate 1/1s that become 2/2s and 3/3s and so on. Still, these are traditionally very strong cards, and I think they are placed well here. All right. The rest of the artifacts collection I think is rather good. I think a lot of the deck makes sense to me, so I want to go into additions right away to kind of talk about what kind of things I can see as options for this deck and directions to go into. And with that, we can kind of talk a little more about this idea of where Jetfire, where +1/+1 counters, and where this strategy kind of converges in a successful way. So the first thing I think about is I think about clue tokens. I think this deck would benefit with a little more interest in getting more investigate and more clue tokens being generated. Mainly because this is a very good outlet for Powerstone mana. It creates more token bodies, bodies I say in quotations, that can be used for a number of other cards, and it is just generally a good answer to a deck that needs a little bit of consistency when it's going to take its time anyways. If we are slowly assembling a board state so that we can have one very explosive turn, using an extra 2 mana here and there to draw a card is going to be very beneficial. I'm also currently putting together an old clue deck I've taken apart, so maybe clues are just on my mind. Piper Wright is the first one that really catches my eye because she naturally works with both the +1/+1 counter plan and the clue plan really nicely. This is something that, like, not only can we use aspects of just dumping a bunch of counters onto her and getting a bunch of clues out of it, but even things like using Manifold Key's ability to make her unblockable to once again generate a bunch of tokens. I think recently we just saw a Tana deck talking about the power of the create or investigate that many times, and something like Piper Wright shows the strength of this, especially because you can always just drop her as 2 mana and get a few clue tokens here and there. I will say, for what it's worth, no, we'll come back to that. Curie is the other one that I forgot about, and I want to take a look at, because, yeah. This Curie could be in here. I don't believe they're in here right now. Curie could be in here. They traditionally don't work with +1/+1 counters, but they work very similarly to Piper in the idea of the importance of getting hits in, and also being able to change certain cards into other cards. I do appreciate that here. I forget what happens when you try to transform. I believe if you try to transform or convert a card that doesn't have a backside, nothing happens, which might be a very interesting result if Curie is to exile your commander on the front side and then be able to take advantage of both the much higher power, but the ability that you can just keep using their ability and never have to worry about transforming them back. All right, another way to make clues, Forensic Gadgeteer is also very interesting because this works also naturally with your deck's plan of generating artifacts and halves the cost of your clue tokens. But let's remember that clue tokens are not the only activated abilities you get from artifacts. And though not every single one of your doublers, in fact I think only one of them uses an activated ability instead of a triggered ability, a bunch of other cards in your deck do have activated abilities, and reducing their mana cost, their activated cost by 1 but not less than 1, is still really, really good. I think Forensic Gadgeteer is a card that I really do appreciate, and if you were to spend all of your mana that you get from your commander onto the clues you've investigated with, the ability to just basically say, oh, it's going to go twice as far because all my clues are cracked for half the mana, is a pretty good card. I do also just once again appreciate how this card naturally fits in the deck, and I think you'll have some good times with it. This one's kind of a strange one, but I did want to suggest this. Esoteric Duplicator is really, really interesting. The way it functions is that if you overpay for it as a clue, you get to keep it. And that's kind of neat, but it also gives this ability to every other card. Now, there's going to be some cards you care for more than others for this ability, but what I do like about this is it does give you another very interesting mana sink that works very well with your other mana sinks. There's something to note that these cards do still go to the graveyard. You create token copies. So if you were to use cards that, for example, would dig out of your graveyard, such as Emery, this might be something that's very interesting to you. Or otherwise, if you were to do something that would copy tokens or generate on-token creation, there's a lot of these kind of cards, and so all of those kind of catch my eye. I think there might be an argument that this card works really well with a cool token doubler, but I don't think that's necessary. I think having this out as a card that you can every now and then throw 4 mana into to draw a card, and in the meantime keep it around to use your other cards better, is kind of neat. I also think the fact that obviously it's a mana sink of all of that mana is very, very good. I'm not entirely sold on this, but it catches my eye as a really nice kind of glue card that can do a lot depending on how you build the deck. Something else I was thinking about, though this doesn't generate clues, this is another way to take mana that you have lying around as a mana sink and not just, transform it into clues, it's to repurpose it as mana for later. Now this is very slow and you only have 1 copy, but cards like this really catch my eye, and I think Collector's Vault is the most accessible of them, where we are turning that 2 mana we get from our commander or anything else and saying we're going to do a quick loot and we're going to get 1 of that mana back as a treasure token. So not only is this just good as a mana sink for your commander ability, I do really like the fact that this allows you to keep going during the combos or during those big turns. Because you might have a turn where you have, let's say, 8 mana in this Powerstone mana and like 2 blue, and you use that 2 blue to maybe dig or draw or get your next card, and you're missing an additional blue. Having Collector's Vault and being able to sink some mana in, get a treasure token, and then immediately use it to make up for the blue mana you are missing could be really, really cool. Obviously, the goal is to have all your mana untapped when you use your commander's ability. Therefore, that like 10 to 15 mana is paired with another 6 of colored mana that you can use. But still, having just extra mana sinks for that is particularly good. This also, once again, creates artifact tokens, which triggers a lot of different things or can trigger things in your deck, and I like that as well. Something else that caught my eye as kind of another glue piece that I particularly like is the Enigma Jewel. Now, the Enigma Jewel generally works very well with some of the clue tokens and other things that I've named, and it also works really well with a set amount of other cards that you have. This also works in all activated abilities and not just your artifacts, and I do like this. But this craft ability, which of course, as you know, is another thing you can sink your commander's mana into, with 4 or more activated abilities, creates the Locus of Enlightenment. So the first thing I like about this is that this repurposes and uses all of the abilities that you might want to copy, you might want to use as a mana sink, and that's particularly good, but it also is just straight up a wonderful, a wonderful mana doubler, right? Or, mana doubler with our commander, but activated ability doubler. And this works really, really well, obviously, if we use something like use our commander's ability and then use the gauntlets or the equipment that we can use to then activate to copy it, giving us, what, 4 copies, I believe. Yeah, 4 copies of that mana, of that not mana ability to generate tons and tons of mana. But once again, that's not even just, you know, how it works with so many other cards in our deck that I particularly like. Moving on, just another card that I thought would be really, really nice is Thought Monitor. I just think it's notably missing in this deck, and as I introduce more tokens, the more I want to play this card. All right, now we're gonna get into this middle bit. It's gonna be real fast because they all do the same thing. But basically, I like these 3: Reality Chip, Mystic Forge, and Crystal Skull. These are all Future Sight cards. I mean the mechanic, not the set, in the idea that you are able to use this to play cards off of the top of your deck. Now they each provide something a little differently. Reality Chip is an artifact creature that you can reconfigure, and once you do, you have the ability. Mystic Forge lets you cast artifact and colorless spells from the top of your deck and can occasionally get rid of the top card. And Crystal Skull is both a mana rock and it casts historic lands, plays historic lands and casts historic spells, which obviously artifacts are therefore casting a large portion of your deck. I think I would play all 3, honestly, and I think this is another really good quote-unquote mana sink, but a card sink or time sink for your deck, where you can set up these kind of boards where you are setting up your combo, but you are also gaining board advantage, because that 8 mana is not just cards in hand onto the battlefield, it can be cards off the top of your deck. For those who aren't familiar with this ability, you have to always remember that when you cast a card off the top of your deck, you have pseudo drawn it as well. So this is better than just casting a card from your hand, dramatically so, as it's basically a free card draw every time and allows you to dig further and further in your deck. So these cards are really, really valuable, and if you have the mana to sink into them with your commander's ability, you can dig pretty deeply. This is including if you have certain card draw in your hand or certain scry effects or anything that can kind of shuffle the top of your deck, which will make this work particularly well. But even then, I think if you don't really invest in those, you can put a few like pseudo fetch lands into your deck. I think you're still very happy with this ability. All right, coming to the end, I'll finally address the thing that I was asked to address, and it is, what is our big, strong win conditions? And I don't have many because, as I said before, I don't really think that's the direction I think the deck will do well in, as I'd rather it run as a really nice, well-oiled machine and have a lot of different directions to use that mana in and be efficient, rather than having one big slam this card down and win. And if, this is a big if, but it's an if that's worth considering, if this is the kind of deck that you're interested in and the thing that's holding you back is the color or the commander, this deck can probably be repurposed into being blue-black or another combination of colors, and then this problem evaporates. The biggest thing that's holding us back is the fact that we are stuck in one color and we don't have access to things like Bolas's Citadel, or we don't have access to things like, I don't know, it's escaping me, but there are definitely other cards that we can invest this mana into that have colors to them, or we have other enablers that will, or payoffs that when we are getting this combo going, we can get more and more cards. That being said, looking at these singular cards, I think by far the strongest one is Urza, Lord High Artificer. Once again, this is the benefit of having a card that is already just generally very, very good, generates a on-theme artifact token that can be very strong by itself, gives us another ability to use all of our artifacts and all of the tokens that we create, but really importantly, gives us probably one of the stronger mana sinks that we're going to have access to. Now, there is a limit to it, right? Like, we are going to be using that mana in 5s, which can make it tricky to use all the mana efficiently, but of course, being able to tap down additional artifacts to generate the few, like, color mana that we need, or the few missing mana that we need to do something with, is going to solve that problem. Now, there might be an argument here that this ability is not the best because of the contents of the deck, where you don't want to be using this to be getting, like, you know, our like egg cards, you know, like Chromatic Star and I'm trying to remember the other one's name. Chromatic Sphere. I was trying to remember what kind of star it was. Yeah, Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star. A lot of these 1 mana artifacts don't have the same kind of impact as you might have by flipping a much bigger card. However, I still think this deck is a critical mass deck, where the more of your deck that's on the battlefield, the better of a time you'll have, and so I think it's a risk worth taking. In the meantime, you can still be using this mana to do other things. You can be tapping down and casting different spells, or you might just luck into like the Thought Monitor or the Kappa Cannoneer or the Portal to Phyrexia and be very, very satisfied with that ability. Obviously, this being a instant speed ability is also a bit of a perk, but overall, I think this is a pretty strong option. The other option that is generally, I see it now and then, and I tend to be impressed by, is Cyber Drive Awakener. Now, Cyber Drive Awakener does have this kind of one-shot style ability, but even then, I think it is very, very good. Gives all of our creatures flying, which our commander doesn't need, all of our artifact creatures flying, and then all of our non-creature artifacts, so our clue tokens, our mana rocks, our utility artifacts, all become 4/4 flyers, and we can use that to swing in and completely take out 1 or 2 opponents. There is a problem that this card only works that turn, much like other overrun effects, but you definitely have the means in this deck to put it in the graveyard, get it back, or make a copy, or otherwise. So it's not the worst thing, but it is worth noting. It is by far the simplest way of winning with a board state like this, and I think it works well with the idea of having your engine functioning, and then the functional engine allows you to win using this card. Whereas instead of slamming down one card that it doesn't matter what your engine is, you just win the game, is a lot harder to manage here. The last card, and one I have a bit of reservation suggesting because of the sheer price tag, is Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Agatha's Soul Cauldron is simultaneously a win condition and an enabler for the deck. It is notably missing here, and if you are playing without a budget, or if you're building this deck and looking for different ideas, Soul Cauldron is probably the best inclusion that you can put in if you can afford it or if you can budget for it. I think with Soul Cauldron, there's also the ability that we start looking in different avenues to make the deck function. We get the advantage of Thirst for Discovery that allows you to, let's just look it up, that allows you to grab cards off the top of your deck. Thirst for Knowledge, that's the one. You draw 3 and you discard 2 if it's not an artifact, though the other thirsts are. I didn't realize the cycle was all thirst. I think that's pretty funny, but it allows you to pseudo loot through your deck, and as cards enter your graveyard, Agatha's Soul Cauldron becomes happier. That's not even including the way that it can exile creatures from your opponent's graveyards to steal activated abilities that are not in your colors. The Soul Cauldron itself, I think, will also do a lot with those +1/+1 counters, because not only is that first +1/+1 counter really, really important for your proliferate effects, but I think the ease of access that you have to spread those counters around and put them on certain creatures will be very, very beneficial. As you know, if you've ever seen this card in action, Walking Ballista is the card you want underneath it, and it allows your entire deck to basically be Triskelions, which are very, very powerful. But even if you don't have that, being able to use certain creatures' activated abilities, such as Urza, is still good enough, I think, and very, very cool. And I think that's generally it on what I have to say for the deck. I think the deck is a really, really cool idea. I feel it's a little bit between a rock and a hard place on how it's going to function, but I think there can be a certain amount of smoothness, to improve it. Perhaps, and I don't know how good of an answer this is this the kind of deck where we end up just cutting down artifacts and creatures and putting a lot more glue cards in the middle, such as card selection, such as card draw, such as some forms of disruption or generalized time cards, Mystic Remora, Rhystic Studies, and the like, to kind of build into a slow combo deck. But I don't think that's what the deck builder wants, and I don't think that's possibly the most interesting version of this deck. I kind of like where this is going as being a pseudo aggro combo deck that just wants to build a slow engine that once it triggers has a very, very explosive turn. And I'm hoping the suggestions I made will help into that direction. If you have suggestions, please comment. I'm feeling a bit of a loss here, so if you can think of things I haven't, I'd be very appreciative. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for watching. Thank you, Lexa, for sending the deck, and good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.